I have a rendezvous with death. We'll preserve the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
No fear. No political correctness. No wokeism. You're listening to Underground USA.
Thanks for downloading, listening, and sharing. My name is Frank Salvato, and you're spending a few moments in Underground USA. As we get down to brass tacks, where the issue of the election and voter fraud is concerned, many people are asking what can be done to reduce the chances of voter fraud taking place, and especially what we can do to make sure that none of the 10 million to 20 million illegal immigrants now in our country vote illegally in our election. It's always smart to explore who should be notified when you witness voting irregularities at the polling place. You can determine the proper chain of communications by contacting your county election commission, county district attorney's office, and/or state election authority. Put these contact cards on your cell phone for immediate and easy access. But there's one entity that can be lobbied to action with the authority to act in real time. That authority is your county sheriff. Sheriffs in the United States hold a unique position within the framework of law enforcement due to several factors. Typically, a sheriff's primary jurisdiction is county-wide. This includes unincorporated areas of the county and any municipalities that contract with the sheriff's office for law enforcement services. Unlike city police, whose jurisdiction ends at city limits, sheriffs have authority across the county. This can sometimes lead to overlapping responsibilities with other authorities, with sheriffs often taking a superseding role. Sheriffs are responsible for a broader range of duties than typical city police officers. These duties include operating county jails, providing security for courthouses and county buildings, serving warrants and court documents, law enforcement in areas not covered by municipal police, and sometimes acting as coroners or conducting autopsies, particularly in less populated counties. Recently, sheriff's authorities have expanded and become particularly notable for several reasons. Sheriffs are predominantly elected officials, which gives them a direct mandate from the public. This election process can lead to a greater degree of independence from local government oversight compared to appointed police chiefs, allowing for more discernment in how the sheriff enforces laws. The role of sheriff dates back to medieval England and has a legacy of broad authority. In the United States, this role has adapted but retained significant power, especially in rural areas where the sheriff might very well be the most prominent or only law enforcement presence. And court rulings have occasionally affirmed or expanded the powers of sheriffs, like in cases where sheriffs have challenged federal laws or when their role in local law enforcement has been upheld against encroachment by other agencies. This brings me to my overarching point where the authority of our county sheriffs is concerned: immigration enforcement. Some sheriffs have taken on roles in immigration enforcement, especially in border states or counties with significant immigrant populations. Their involvement can range from cooperating with federal immigration authorities to actively detaining undocumented immigrants, which has expanded their role significantly in recent years. The authority of a sheriff over an election polling place in the United States can be understood through several lenses. A sheriff or their deputies are often responsible for maintaining peace and order at polling places. This includes preventing disturbances, ensuring that no one is intimidated or obstructed from voting, and dealing with any criminal activity, such as voter intimidation or disruption. They might be present or have deputies stationed at polling places, especially in contentious elections or areas with a history of electoral disputes, to ensure that the voting process is conducted smoothly. While the primary enforcement of voting rights might fall to election officials or federal authorities in cases of significant violations, sheriffs can ensure that local and state election laws are followed. This includes addressing issues like illegal campaigning too close to the polling place, or ensuring that only authorized individuals are in areas where voting occurs. Sheriffs can enforce laws against electioneering at or near polling places, which involves campaigning or trying to influence voters within a certain distance from where voting occurs. If any criminal activity occurs, like assault, voter fraud, or significant disruption, sheriffs have the authority to make arrests or detain individuals until further legal action can be taken. Sheriffs often coordinate with elected officials. While election officials manage the voting process, sheriffs support it by ensuring the environment around voting is safe and lawful. They might respond to calls from election judges or clerks regarding any issues that require law enforcement. Now, it's important to note here that sheriffs don't have authority over the election process itself. They can't administratively decide who can vote, count votes, or interfere with the voting or tabulation process. Their role is protective, but law enforcement related. Sheriffs must also be aware of federal laws regarding elections, including the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits racial discrimination in voting. Their actions at polling places must not infringe on anyone's civil rights, but this authority also includes preserving the sanctity of the ballot box, which includes guarding against the illegal dilution of the citizens' votes. In all honesty, a sheriff's ability to thwart illegal immigrants from committing voter fraud can be as simple as maintaining a presence outside the polling places and very publicly issuing preemptive statements that election law, including the prevention of illegal ballots being cast, will be enforced regardless of what either political party has advocated for. In the end, we the people don't necessarily need to wait for our corrupt federally elected officials to overcome their deep state masters and pass meaningful election reform laws that actually defend citizens' rights to vote and the sanctity of the ballot box. All we need are sheriffs with balls. When we come back, our segment on America's Third Watch, broadcast nationally from our flagship station WGUL, AM 930 and FM 93.7 in Tampa, Florida.
You're listening to Underground USA.
Bank of America wants to control how you live your life. They're building a system to track your carbon emissions and monitor your driving, coming after your Second Amendment rights, favoring certain homebuyers based on their race. Bank of America is using a social score system straight out of China's playbook. Bank of America is obsessed with trying to control your life. What will they do next? Bank of America. Their lies start with their name.
When a government restricts the free speech of its people, it disrupts freedom and societal function, casting a shadow over the democratic process and the diversity of ideas. Free speech restrictions lead to countries where only certain viewpoints are heard. They stifle opposition and reduce the democratic process to a disingenuous formality. When people fear repercussions for their speech, they self-censor. This doesn't just limit controversial or offensive speech, but also destroys innovation, creativity, and even necessary discourse. Over time, this leads to a homogenization of thought, where only safe or approved ideas are expressed. And suppressing speech doesn't eliminate the underlying issues or beliefs, but drives them underground. Governments that curtail free speech do so to maintain control. When speech is controlled, it's easier for those in power to manipulate narratives, suppress dissent, and maintain their grip on power. That's why, when Kamala Harris says this, we should all be alarmed.
There has to be a responsibility that is placed on these social media sites to understand their power. They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation. And that has to stop.
Any government's fascist restriction of free speech sets off a domino effect where freedom incrementally disappears. It's a foundational right that supports the structure of all other liberties, and its restriction can lead to a society where control overshadows freedom. And that appears to be quite all right with far-left Democrats, the DNC, and the Harris campaign. They're not saying it, but your right to free speech is on the ballot this November. Vote accordingly.
News, insight, passion. AM 930, The Answer.
Yeah, well, let's just start right there, why don't we? I don't want to make America like Detroit. I'm not trying to be mean, but I don't think America should be like Detroit. Detroit has a plethora of problems over so many years.
Yeah, including the fact that Lizzo's pushing it. I mean, Lizzo, really? This is what we've come down to? Campaigning with Lizzo?
Yep. And she says she's already voted, by the way, too.
Yeah, I'm sure she voted appropriately too. I care what Lizzo has to say. But the fact that she was saying that America needs to be looking more like Detroit should tell you everything you need to know about today's Democrat Party and their candidate.
Yeah. Well, she was trying, I think, to spin something about, well, you're going to be proud like Detroit, resilient like Detroit, things like that. But honestly, Frank, I mean, I can't imagine that this all got cleared and said, yeah, go out and say stuff like that, because that's what we need at this point. It's like saying, let's make America like California.
Yeah, which we definitely don't want to do.
Right.
You know, but their message is ringing hollow with people, and the polls are reflecting that. And I'm not even a big believer in polls, but it's just impossible not to look at the momentum and what side has it and what side is just hemorrhaging support at this point in time. When polls are this lopsided, especially the betting polls, that says something. And right now it looks like a Trump victory. Now, saying that, do not become overconfident.
Yep.
Because we have to beat the cheat by more than 20%. And I've been saying that ever since this campaign began, 4 years ago. You know,
you're exactly right. Yeah.
We have got to win by an unmistakable margin so that any ballots that have been pre-printed or will be counted after the polls close, that weren't cast during the time when the polls were open, that we can beat that. That's a factor in this election, and that's just a thing.
No, well, you're right about that. And that's why everybody has to keep playing this thing like we're, 10 runs behind and it's the ninth inning here, only because that enthusiasm, and people I still think have a lot of enthusiasm for Trump. In other words, that it would hopefully eclipse any enthusiasm for Harris. We know that it's out there, but their campaign has turned a real different tone over the last few days, and they've just gone negative, and gone is the hopes and joys and aspirations and fun, that of sitting there with Oprah, for example.
Well, that's your Carville. That's your Carville influence right there, negative campaigning. Democrats love negative campaigning because, sadly, negative campaigning rings with a lot of people. But when your economy is as bad as it is today, and when you are on the cusp of World War III, and that's not an exaggeration, negative campaigning doesn't hold a lot of weight. People feel the hurt in their wallet, and they're nervous because all they hear about is transgender this, LGBTQ that, transgender surgery this, racism that, when there are very real problems in this world today that affect more than just 1% or 2% of the population.
You're exactly right about that. And, again, I think that we are seeing the shift in momentum, but we can't get complacent about it at all. And I don't think Trump is either. I think, especially going out to this McDonald's was, just an amazing sort of campaign maneuver. and people were pulling up to the window and just, gushing about how wonderful it was to see him. And I was telling Denise Simon earlier, Frank, not one person seemed to get out of hand or say, yeah, I don't like you, Donald Trump, because of blah, blah, blah. Everybody, wherever he goes, to these bodegas or to the barber shops and so forth, people are just happy to see him, even if they might not agree with him on every little thing.
Well, it wasn't unique for him to go serve up fast food. It's every president has to do that these days. But I'm sure he was demonstrating that he can do it when Kamala can only lie about it.
No kidding. That's right, because he has worked now more at McDonald's than Kamala Harris ever did. And they've looked into this, too. There's no evidence to support that she ever did actually work there.
Yeah, there was a sign behind him in one of the pictures that's making the round on social media. It says 1 in 8 Americans has worked at McDonald's. Well, Kamala's part of that percentage that never worked at McDonald's.
That's right. Well, Kamala was, in fact, out there and being asked by an NBC reporter about, again, differing at all with Joe Biden. And she sidestepped that by saying, oh, no, well, it's a tradition. Even with Mike Pence, for some reason she had to mention Mike Pence, that, you don't criticize your president. And the reporter actually said, well, hasn't he told you can go out and say whatever you want? I mean, implying that this is a pretty important thing that you're doing here. And but she still just went along with, I'm a new generation of leadership.
No, that's because Joe Biden's not the one that gave her permission to run. Barack Obama was.
You're right about that.
This is the opportunity that we've been waiting for since 2008. If we can trounce Kamala Harris at the polls, and I mean Reagan-esque landslide victory, I don't think it's going to be that big, but I do have a good feeling about a sizable margin. I think we're going to hit that 20% if we don't get complacent.
Right.
But we get to sink the Obama ship. He thought he could pull off a Clinton thing. He really did. He thought he was going to be the behind-the-scenes shadowy puppet master for the next 30 years, that he was going to be able to run the Democrat Party out of wherever he wanted to run it from, or off his phone from the beach or the golf course or wherever, and that his nod will need to be received, that his ring will need to be kissed, and that the Democrat Party still ran with Obama as the supreme leader. But with a crushing defeat at the polls, we end that for good. And we send him that ideology, that incredibly far-left, progressive, neo-Marxist ideology, back to the furthest left nether regions of Chicago. And it can't happen too quickly.
Well, Frank, what you're describing here, this is the best 2-for-1 deal ever for the American people. You get Donald Trump in the Oval Office, and you get to send Harris and Obama packing like that. I mean, that's just, if that, for that alone, we should have a massive turnout of voters.
Well, and that's an overarching point here. You don't have to be a Donald Trump supporter in order to have something to vote for this election. You can vote against the Marxist soft revolution that's happening in the United States, and that has been happening in the United States since Obama walked into the Oval Office. This is a moment in time when your vote against something is worth just as much as your vote for something. So if you're still on the fence about Donald Trump, get over that. Because this election is about a lot more than whether you like the way Donald Trump talks or not. Mm-hmm. The fact that you can't recognize that his policies were infinitely better for our country than Joe Biden's and Obama 2.0's is kind of stunning. So if that message hasn't reached you yet, vote to keep the Marxist out of office.
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned about message, because the message about Donald Trump now from the campaign and others the left and the media, is that Donald Trump is going to become a dictator. We've heard all this stuff, but really, it's the far left that want to do this fundamental transformation of America. As you mentioned, Obama coming into office in 2008, they so desperately want to remake America or tear it down and put something else in its place, whereas Donald Trump is not looking to fundamentally transform the United States. He's trying to get it back to where it's supposed to be on course, and that's a whole different thing. And to something else you were saying too, Frank, why would you want to have this kind of power forever, like Obama does, unless you really needed to, again, transform things into something else that the United States was never meant to be?
Well, Obama's a Marxist. He wasn't shy about it. Hillary Clinton's a Marxist. She's not shy about it. This all started with Woodrow Wilson. You've heard me say it a zillion times. Mm-hmm. And the ushering in of the progressive movement. It went radically left almost immediately, where they said, experts, we should have more experts in government. We'll just listen to the experts. We're not going to, Congress has a task to do by representing the people, but they should listen to the experts. Well, that's installing an ipso facto kind of Politburo of academia. And that's exactly what Wilson did. And over the years, the far left has grown and grown and grown inside the Democrat Party until they executed their hostile takeover of that party and elevated Barack Obama. Some people would argue Bill Clinton was part of that, but he understood how to play the game. Barack Obama just said, it's time. We're 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America. And progressives don't like the Constitution. They think it's too restricting, too confining. Yeah. They want to be able to change things when they want to change it because they believe they know best. Not the people elected to represent the people that they're supposed to represent from every corner of the country, this small elite group of people. Well, we've had that under Obama for 8 years, and we've absolutely had that under Biden-Harris for the last 4 years, where a small group of people are making the decisions and puppet mastering the people who get in front of the camera.
Mm-hmm. Well, exactly right. And even that term transformation, it's supposed to sound like it's going to be good, or it's going to be progressive, basically. And people hear that and think, oh, that's a good thing. But honestly, how many things need to be fundamentally transformed? If you walked into somebody's house and said, I'm going to transform your house, they may not like that idea because they may like it the way that it is, or it's no longer going to be their house or their business or their car or whatever it might be. But, America doesn't need to be transformed. That's where I think the first error is here.
They've been hawking this idea that the Constitution is the Bill of Rights for a very long time. The Constitution is a framework for our system of government. Mm-hmm. That's the way our government works. When you read the Constitution, you understand how our government works, the way it's set up to work. The Bill of Rights that were added in order to be able to ratify the Constitution codifies our inalienable rights that are always there. Government doesn't have any purview over over how they're interpreted or anything else. Free speech is free speech. It's the right to bear arms. It's the right to bear arms. If you need a warrant to go in and search somebody's house, and especially the 9th and 10th Amendments, where it says, hey, if it's not in the Constitution, it's not the federal government's purview. But progressives, ever since Wilson, have been hacking away at the Bill of Rights so that they are the bestower of rights, so that they are the ones that give you your rights. Why do you think when they talk about something that they really want to pass, they call it a right? You have a right to health care. You have a right. You have a right to an abortion. You have a right to that. Those aren't inalienable rights. Those are social issues. You want to argue and debate them and try to pass laws on them? That's fine. But don't tell me it's a right, because it's not.
But that's exactly where we're at with the abortion issue, because everybody says they went and took your rights away, blah, 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 that kind of stuff.
And that's not even a correct interpretation of what happened. They kicked everything. They kicked it back per the 9th and 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights to the states where it belongs, because we're 50 separate states with 50 separate constitutions, 50 separate social laboratories that our nation learns from. States learn from each other.
Well, Frank, you mentioned something earlier about the federal government versus the state, the 50 separate states. And really, there has been this ongoing sort of march towards, the federal government. It truly is. It's like, I hate to say it, but it's like the king or the sovereign it's just so centralized for every aspect of our lives. That was never the intention. And yet that's one of the reasons why the Democrats keep saying we're going to have a national abortion law, or the opposite. Trump will bring in a national abortion ban, again, perpetuating this notion that everything comes from Mount Olympus in Washington. And that's a great disservice to how our nation is actually really set up.
Well, and this lends to the notion that the people who go into federal government and the deep state, they don't care about the Constitution. They want to centralize government in Washington, D.C., so that there's one central power, and everybody, all the other states and all the citizens are subservient to the federal government. There have been court decisions that are egregious to how the framers set up our country, that say, well, the federal government is always superior. It's always superior. If the states and the federal government clash, the federal government is superior, and then we defer to the federal government in those matters. That needs to be challenged. It needs to be challenged in matters that are under the federal purview, per the Constitution. Yes, the federal government wins out when you go head-to-head with the states. But because the federal government was never supposed to have the biggest presence in your life, and your state governments were supposed to be the ones that had more of a presence, it makes sense that the federal government wouldn't be superior in everything, and there wouldn't be a centralization of power. So when you hear, people on both sides of the aisle, Kyle, really talking about how the federal government is going to do this for you, and how we're going to pass a law to do that for you, and how we can give you this, we can give you that. That's just a continuation of the consolidation of power into a central authority in Washington, D.C. Quite honestly, a good constitutionalist politician or member of government would be saying, you know what? We need to divest from this as a federal government and give those funds back to the states. Because the states know best how to spend their money in their states. The needs of Florida are different from the needs of the people in Washington state. Same for Maine and California. Mm-hmm. There are certain things that we all need, but that's covered under the Constitution. But this wanting to rule every aspect of your life by regulation, through agencies, through departments, through commissions at the federal level, they shouldn't exist. From left to right, top to bottom, they should be the purview of the states.
Well, sure. But again, you've got this thing of, for example, if as a member of the federal government, let's say I'm a representative or some such thing, there's always this thing of, well, wait a minute, if we divest ourselves, we're not going to have that money to spend. I'm not going to be able to say to my district, look how much federal money I brought back for you.
Shock of shocks.
Yeah, and then stay in power. Yeah. That's
the point. It's all about power plays and illusion. It's a show. Our representatives going to Washington, D.C. should be bored at work. And the direct election of senators, which was the biggest catastrophe ever to happen to our nation constitutionally, just started this sprint to the graft. Everybody who goes to Washington, well, we got to get in front of the microphones every so often and make sure people understand that I'm important and I've done something for you. And that's why we're going to spend $70 million to rename post offices. No, that's not what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about serving the people, and the federal government has a limited capacity. The Constitution is clear. So you want a good politician? Have somebody who's going to go into office saying they're going to deregulate and start calling for the repeal or the sunsetting of laws that have overstepped their bounds and overlapped onto the authorities of the states. And quite honestly, the only person I've seen do that since Ronald Reagan was Donald Trump.
Right. Exactly. No, I like your phrase, you should be bored at the federal level. Makes a lot of sense.
I would rather you go out to lunch and talk with your lobbyist people than sit there making up inane laws that encroach on my freedoms and make me jump through more hoops because there's another form to fill out at the federal level for me to start a business or live my life.
Indeed. And again, it becomes, and also too, this is all part and parcel of getting rid of the Electoral College, for example, because that way everyone's just going to vote for the sovereign, basically, and no longer will you have the so-called flyover states involved, but then there's going to be that mob rule where they're just going to elect whoever, and then they'll just make decisions top down in perpetuity forever.
And that's why it's so important to pay attention to your state politics. That's why it's very important that you don't just focus on the consolidation of power in Washington, D.C. At your state level, if your state is signed on to this movement to make where whoever wins the popular vote wins our Electoral College votes, vote everybody out of office in your state that's going for that, and make sure that laws are passed in your state that reverse that decision, because it is a grand march towards a centralized government, and from that will only come tyranny and despotism.
Well, that's exactly right. And we hear those words in the history books, when you're learning about the American Revolution in and of itself was because of tyranny. And yet today it's almost as if you have a lot of people out there and in the country that are saying to themselves, well, no, this is the good tyranny because it's going to be one person, one vote, and will finally be a true democracy. And they don't have any clue, unfortunately, what that really leads to, as you were just saying.
This is why it's so important for the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers to be taught in our schools and examined in the classroom so everyone's paying attention. From junior high school to high school into college, it should be a requirement across the board, because it talks about how dangerous pure democracy is. When you have pure democracy, one person and one vote, and that's the way we're going, then you have no protections for the minority except for what the anointed class says those rights are. And that obliterates inalienable rights. It just shreds the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, because they would conceivably get together one day and say, yeah, we don't like that Second Amendment anymore. We all voted and we're pretty sure that we don't need that anymore. So, sorry, yet it's literally that terrible, where the majority can, again, simply have a reign of terror over everybody.
With a pure democracy centralized government, because you have no protection for the minority, the government becomes the alpha and the omega, and religions don't mean anything anymore. Right. So if you're a churchgoer, doesn't really matter. You can know what's morally and ethically right, but your government is going to tell you what your rights are. And if you step out of line, welcome to 1984.
You're listening to Underground USA.
Our First Amendment right to free speech is under attack by woke activists and politicians. Wokeism seeks to suppress opinions and ideas that are deemed offensive, insensitive, or problematic, thereby stifling the free exchange of ideas and the pursuit of truth. It emphasizes social justice, identity politics, political correctness and the regulation of language, and relies on euphemisms and ambiguous language to create the illusion of consensus, thus avoiding confrontation with opposing viewpoints. Wokeism is antithetical to free speech because it stifles the free exchange of ideas and the pursuit of truth. This is in direct opposition to the principles of free speech. Wokeism is an ideological cancer shopped by those who want to control you. This November, we have an opportunity to render wokeness to the ash heap of history. Vote smart. Vote against wokeness and those who would use it to control you.
And, we have to stay woke. Like, everybody needs to be woke. And you can talk about if you're the wokest or woker, but just stay more woke than less woke.
The federal government is becoming more centralized by the day. Opportunistic politicians are centralizing power in Washington, D.C., and incrementally whittling away at our rights. Should the worst-case scenario play out and Kamala Harris and Obama 3.0 assume power on November 5th, we must be prepared with a plan to rein in the Marxism they will unleash through the federal government. Nullification, the case for decentralizing the federal government by Frank Salvato, lays out a plan in which the state governments can claw back their sovereignty from the overreach of the federal government, saving us from a second bloody civil war. Arm yourself with the knowledge of this nation-saving option. Get your copy of Nullification, the case for decentralizing the federal government, available on Amazon.com in Kindle form and paperback.
If you like the podcast, please head over to undergroundusa.com and sign up for our Substack. It brings every article and new podcast into your email inbox, circumventing the censors and the fact-checkers. And remember to talk politics, religion, and current events with your friends, family, acquaintances, and colleagues. When we start to understand that we have more in common than we have in difference through conversing on these topics, that's when the opportunistic politicians connected to the deep state lose. That's when their power to divide us stops. And please remember the people who lost everything during the current storms, especially the people in West North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, and Northern Georgia. Just because the mainstream media complex has moved on from the story doesn't mean they still don't need our help, materially, financially, and especially at the ballot box. You're listening to Underground USA. No fear, no political correctness, no wokeism. My name is Frank Salvato.